This is a film about the secret war which America waged on Charles de Gaulle, a war that lasted from 1961 to 1969. It draws on recently declassified archives and notes and confidential reports from the CIA, the Pentagon, and the American State Department, as well as on eyewitness accounts from the advisors, collaborators, and ministers of Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon, and Charles de Gaulle. Extract from a CIA report. De Gaulle, Charles, born 22nd November 1890 in Lille, in excellent health. Short working days, 8:30 a.m. to 7 p.m. Never answers the telephone after 8 p.m. except in times of emergency. No longer reads novels, only essays, especially about nuclear science. On Wednesday, the 31st of May, 1961, de Gaulle played host in Paris to his American friend, John F. Kennedy, President of the United States. With the international situation strained, Kennedy decided to drop in on his famously difficult ally before going on to confront Khrushchev in Vienna. In preparation, Kennedy pored over the documents prepared by the CIA and the State Department. De Gaulle is distant and austere, his gestures are strange and his speech below average, but he has dazzling style and is a pragmatist. Against the advice of his security men, he liked to wade into the crowd, shaking hands.
Every man has two countries, France and his own.
Two of President Kennedy's advisors, Arthur Schlesinger and Ted Sorensen, prepared the meeting in Paris.
The trip to Paris was of considerable importance for President, partly because this was his first foreign trip as a president, partly because he greatly admired General de Gaulle as a historic figure.
France was our oldest ally. France had its own small-scale nuclear force, which was necessarily, for better or for worse, a consideration in our planning and analyses of the European military scene. Moreover, the fact that de Gaulle knew Khrushchev, whom Kennedy was about to meet for the first time, the fact that de Gaulle had had negotiations and dealings with the Soviet Union meant that he had first-hand information that Kennedy valued and wanted to learn about.
Huge crowds of people turned out. It was a good beginning to the trip. In Kennedy's de Gaulle dossier was this report written for Arthur Schlesinger by a French contact.
De Gaulle is a most impressive and commanding personality, but no one should, for this reason, be unduly intimidated by him. The President should not hesitate to express disagreement. De Gaulle may become huffy, but he respects candor. He is essentially shy and finds it hard to meet people. He must always overcome feelings of timidity. He prefers tete-a-tete meetings to meetings in groups. Never forget that there is a strain of madness in de Gaulle. He once said to me, "I have two brothers. One is crazy and we had to put him away. The other is normal. I am in between."
At 12 noon in the Élysée Palace, the first discussion focused on the situation in Berlin, a city that Khrushchev was threatening to split in two. Kennedy was worried about the possibility of war. Did de Gaulle want to negotiate? No, he replied. Negotiating is tantamount to capitulating. What do we do then? Asked Kennedy, irritated. If Khrushchev wants a war, said de Gaulle, make sure he understands that war is exactly what he'll get. Kennedy was much weakened by the recent debacle of the Bay of Pigs in Cuba, whereas de Gaulle had just crushed a general's putsch in Algeria. Had the CIA been involved in this plot against de Gaulle? The two men never discussed it. Best let sleeping dogs lie. But de Gaulle was so keen to tackle the second subject of the day that he forgot Pierre Salinger was still in the office.
I was with Kennedy, and all of a sudden, Charles de Gaulle said to Kennedy, "Listen, Mr. President, I've got to tell you something very important. You cannot intervene a war in Vietnam. Look at us. We've lost that war in Vietnam, and I know that you are going to lose that war in Vietnam. You should never do it.
In any case, de Gaulle categorically refused to help America in this conflict, and Kennedy would long bear a grudge. The first day's discussions ended with de Gaulle assuming his historically famous role, by far the one Kennedy preferred. The discussions would continue the following day. There is no doubt that Charles de Gaulle was charmed by Jackie Kennedy. It was she who made this trip to Paris a success. During one lunch, de Gaulle spoke to her about Churchill, a tough nut who was always changing his mind, about Roosevelt, whose only wish was to be rid of de Gaulle, and about Truman, a door-to-door salesman. On Thursday, the 1st of June, a huge reception was held in Versailles. Jackie was dressed in French haute couture, and the press was in raptures before her obvious charm. With false humility, the American president said to the journalists,
Let me introduce myself. I'm the man who brought Jacqueline Bouvier Kennedy to Paris.
It was this triumph which history would remember. But once the party was over, a bitter taste remained, for it was now time to tackle the two subjects very much on both men's minds: the atomic bomb and NATO. On June 1st, Kennedy went alone to NATO headquarters at the Porte Dauphine in Paris. Back at the Élysée Palace, de Gaulle expressed his reservations. The French wanted to be less dependent on American decisions. In fact, they wanted to leave NATO altogether.
Le général savait très bien qu'il fallait se battre pour être l'un des 4 ou 5 grands qui se partageaient les destinées du monde. Il aurait pu s'aligner, il ne s'est jamais aligné. Et la seule façon d'être reconnu dans l'ordre international, c'est d'avoir l'arme atomique.
De Gaulle wanted to be sure that Kennedy would use his atomic weapons if the Soviet Union attacked Europe. His questions annoyed Kennedy, who wanted him to play down their differences so as not to weaken his position when he met Khrushchev the following day in Vienna. A few hours before leaving, Kennedy met de Gaulle for a last discussion devoted to the atomic bomb problem. Above all else, Kennedy wanted to dissuade de Gaulle from developing his own atomic strike force. An advisor told Schlesinger that de Gaulle wanted the bomb for psychological reasons. Kennedy tried to reassure him. This trip to Paris set the tone for Franco-American relations for the next 8 years. Kennedy's admiration for the general soon turned to exasperation. They would not meet again. 40 years on, Schlesinger's skepticism is still apparent.
I think any disappointment that Kennedy may have felt on the question of de Gaulle was soon overwhelmed by the much more acute disappointment he had over his conversations with Khrushchev. So when he came back to the United States, he was much more concerned about his talks with Khrushchev than he was about his talks with de Gaulle. He saw de Gaulle as a kind of historic figure and was willing to pardon him for some of his excesses. It wasn't as if he were reacting to a contemporary.
I found General de Gaulle far more interested in our frankly stating our position, whether or not it was his own, than in appearing to agree with him when we do not. For he knows full well the true meaning of an alliance. He is, after all, the only major leader of World War II who still occupies a position of great responsibility. General de Gaulle could not have been more cordial, and I could not have more confidence in any man.
On the 4th of August 1961, America, which had hitherto only been interested in Soviet atomic tests, established a secret base for observing French underground tests in the Sahara. The Americans wanted this base to be in Mali or the Niger, but ended up in Libya. The French, of course, were unaware that they were being observed by their American allies.
Kennedy knew, he knew in his bones, really, that Khrushchev would be forced to put up a wall.
In Berlin, tension mounted all during the summer of 1961. To stop the huge exodus of Germans to the west, Khrushchev decided to put up a barbed wire fence.
De Gaulle pensait qu'il n'était pas question d'entrer dans une négociation qui aboutirait à régulariser une situation qui était une situation de fait, je le rappelle.
The Soviet secret services knew that France and Kennedy did not agree, so Khrushchev felt free to act. But did de Gaulle know that Kennedy had already accepted that the Berlin Wall would be built?
He talked about this very openly with me. He said that I cannot bring NATO into a conflict in Europe by going into East Berlin or East Germany. They will not support that. They will support barely the defense of West Berlin. Try to take Berlin, it means a big war. Under these circumstances, Khrushchev will try, but in the end, he will have to do something to prevent this outpouring of citizens from East Germany to the West. And he said, I think it will be a wall.
Despite everything, Kennedy sent in reinforcements to reassure Berliners. On the morning of the 13th August, de Gaulle was informed that barbed wire fences had cut Berlin in two. De Gaulle claimed to have been in favor of an immediate military riposte, blamed the military high command for requesting approval from the Allies, and maintained that he had been unable to contact either Kennedy or Macmillan. Did he really want to send in his tanks against the barbed wire?
Qu'il y ait pensé, c'est possible, mais il avait trop d'expérience militaire pour savoir qu'il ne pouvait pas engager les forces françaises en Allemagne indépendamment des forces américaines.
Did the general say one thing but think another?
The French came along, but they couldn't take the public position that they were in favor of a split Germany. That would disturb the Germans and others. The wall was fine, and that was a good solution from their point of view.
The barbed wire was soon replaced by a concrete wall. De Gaulle laid the blame at Kennedy's feet, claiming that he had lost his nerve. The Americans saw it differently.
President Kennedy had no choice but to negotiate with the Soviet Union if they were to preserve the peace and not precipitate a World War III, probably the final war, because it would surely be a nuclear war. President Kennedy, therefore, was unwilling to take a position of no negotiations.
For 3 months, there was a face-off between Allied and Soviet tanks in Berlin.
This is the terror that once again casts its eerie shadow over the face of the earth. The hydrogen bomb, the bomb that Khrushchev announces will once again undergo tests by the Russians.
On 30th October 1961, Khrushchev broke all agreements and resumed testing of the H-bomb. The new American ambassador to Paris, James Gavin, commented on the French position.
Well, yes, I was with General De Gaulle Saturday after the announcement of the resumption of the test and the comment on the 100-megaton weapon. We talked about the psychological aspects of this, why it was done, the increased tension. And as you know, General De Gaulle feels that in this atmosphere of tension and a buildup of tension, we should not rush to negotiate.
Kennedy wanted a way out of this confrontation with the USSR, and asked France to join in negotiations. On 12th December, he telephoned de Gaulle, who told him, "You don't want to die for Berlin, neither do the Russians." This new refusal antagonized Kennedy. On 31st December, he wrote, "Your presence would add strength and influence to our undertaking." Whether in retaliation or as an attempt at bribery, Kennedy told France that America refused to help it develop a nuclear strike force. If we were to help you, we would have no reason for resisting pressure from the Germans to accord them the same treatment. France reacted badly to this letter, but for the Americans, the reasons for the refusal were much simpler.
Kennedy was strongly against nuclear proliferation, whether those additional weapons were in the hands of adversaries, neutrals, or allies. The more independent the nuclear powers there are, the more dangerous the world is, and the easier it is for a nuclear war to start, even by accident or miscalculation or misintention. And the force de frappe was too small to defend France, much less the West, but too large to have a peaceful, stable Europe.
Hiroshima, c'était 10 hommes, un avion, une bombe. Eh bien, ces 10 hommes, cet avion et cette bombe arrêtaient un conflit qui avait duré 4 ans et dans lequel s'étaient engagés par dizaines de milliers des chars, des avions, des canons. Et là, tout était ramené à l'unité. Et ça, le général de Gaulle l'a saisi tout de suite quand il a dit « Vous avez raison, il suffira que nous soyons capables de leur arracher un bras. » Voilà l'arme qui lui permet d'intimider pour qu'on lui fiche la paix, pour qu'elle ne fasse plus jamais la guerre.
The Americans justified their refusal by citing the McMahon Law, which forbids them from exporting nuclear capability to a foreign power. The law was scrupulously applied to de Gaulle after his return to power. He explained his position at the time to Eisenhower.
Après le dîner, les deux vieux généraux se sont retirés en robe de chambre devant la cheminée. De Gaulle a eu une phrase tout à fait extraordinaire. Il a dit « Je vais retirer notre armée de l'Afrique du Nord. Ce sera une armée qui n'aura plus de raison d'être s'il n'a pas les armes les plus modernes qui existent. Pour que cette armée maintienne sa cohésion et son efficacité, il faudra que je la dote, en compensation de l'Afrique du Nord, des armes les plus modernes. » Et naturellement, la question nucléaire est apparue. Eisenhower lui a dit « Pourquoi pensez-vous avoir besoin de bombes nucléaires ?» De Gaulle lui a répondu « Vous, Eisenhower, vous vous battrez pour l'Europe parce que vous savez ce qui est en jeu. Vous avez été obligé de le reconquérir. Mais le jour viendra où l'Union soviétique aura les moyens d'atteindre l'Amérique du Nord. Ce jour-là, un de vos successeurs ne fera une guerre nucléaire que pour défendre l'Amérique du Nord. Ce jour-là, j'aurai besoin d'être insupportable tout seul. Voilà pourquoi il me faut des bombes. »
In the White House, some were for, some were against. The CIA kept Kennedy informed on how the French force de frappe was coming along. The bomb was going to cost the French a lot of money. Why were the Americans so unwilling to help?
Il y avait le vieux complexe anglo-saxon, calviniste, anti-latin. On ne peut pas lui confier le feu du ciel, on ne sait pas ce qu'il peut faire, il peut faire des pires bêtises. Non, il faut que ça reste entre nous. Hélas, on n'a pas pu empêcher que la Russie devienne nucléaire, mais il faut empêcher que la France le devienne.
At NATO meetings, McNamara tried to dissuade the French defense minister, Pierre Mesmer, from undertaking a French nuclear program.
Le raisonnement de McNamara était un raisonnement essentiellement économique et financier. C'est trop cher. Vous n'y arriverez pas parce que c'est trop cher. Vous vous ruinerez. Et en plus, ça ne servira à rien parce que pour avoir un système d'armes opérationnel, il faut que vous ayez des fusées, il faut que vous ayez des sous-marins nucléaires ou des avions, et vous verrez que ces systèmes d'armes sont d'un prix incroyablement élevé. Et que le budget militaire français serait beaucoup mieux employé, pense-t-il, en dépensant de l'argent pour les armes classiques.
France only had the A-bomb and a few Mirage jets. What it wanted was the thermonuclear bomb. If the United States provided its know-how, France would save billions of francs as well as a lot of time. But Kennedy still said no.
I always felt that Kennedy was wrong. First, I thought it was not bad for the United States to have an ally who understood something about nuclear weapons, because that meant that we were not alone in making judgments on these issues. Secondly, I had understanding for the French point of view that in issues of ultimate emergency, you must have some capability. And thirdly, we had agreed that Britain could have it, so why should France not have it?
James Gavin had great trouble procuring the sale to France of supply planes for its Mirage 4 jets. Clashing with the Kennedy administration over its attitude to France, he resigned as French ambassador.
Our governments have different views on, for example, the soundness or not of the French independent nuclear program. The French question our tendency, as they put it, to want to negotiate about Berlin. They think negotiations are quite inappropriate. They are reluctant to attend meetings on the subject of nuclear testing cessation. These are not of great importance, but they nevertheless exist. Perhaps there are other minor differences too.
After Algeria gained independence on the 3rd of July 1962, de Gaulle was able to devote more time to foreign policy. He made his famous Emperor of Europe trip to Germany, but avoided Berlin, a way of showing his disapproval of the wall of shame for which he blamed Kennedy.
Die, unsere beiden Völker, schon einander vertrauen.
De Gaulle was going too far. The American State Department kept a close watch on Franco-German talks. "20th October saw the beginning of the Cuban Missile Crisis. A spy plane took photographs of Soviet nuclear missile sites on the island. Chairing an emergency cabinet meeting, Kennedy ordered the blockade of Cuba. The whole world teetered on the brink of nuclear war. And what about France?
Kennedy did not want to make this a conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union. He wanted to make it a conflict between the Soviet Union on the one hand and the Western democracies in general on the other.
He wanted to make certain that the most important leaders of Europe, De Gaulle, Macmillan, Adenauer, had a clear understanding of what the United States was doing and why we were doing it.
A special envoy, Dean Acheson, was sent to Paris, but de Gaulle was the last head of state informed after Macmillan and Adenauer at 5 p.m. on the 22nd of October.
I talked to Dean Acheson afterwards, and he said of all the leaders he saw, which included Macmillan, de Gaulle, Adenauer, he was most impressed by de Gaulle.
Kennedy expected de Gaulle to support the American initiative.
All the others wanted to see pictures and evidence, and de Gaulle said he didn't want to bother with looking at the pictures.
Il dit, les États-Unis sont menacés sur leur territoire, et par conséquent, la France se trouve aux côtés des États-Unis.
Kennedy was relieved that de Gaulle did it with such strength and clarity.
Kennedy was not asking him for advice, simply his support. The crisis came to an end when the Soviets removed their missiles from Cuba. There was one curious development. At the heart of the crisis, Kennedy told Dean Rusk to promise to help France with its nuclear program in return for de Gaulle's support. But Rusk, who didn't like de Gaulle, never passed on the proposition.
As far as I know, his only mission was to fully brief General De Gaulle.
Il l'a peut-être dit, mais ils n'ont jamais rien fait.
I'm not so certain that President Kennedy was prepared to share all nuclear secrets.
Is the idea of such a deal so embarrassing that it's still difficult to speak about it even today? Would it have changed anything? From now on, de Gaulle had to deal with the new ambassador to Paris, the anti-Gaullist Charles Bolan. Behind the smiles during Macmillan's visit to Paris lay France's refusal to allow Great Britain into the common market. Why such intransigence?
De Gaulle had his own line on Europe. He regarded Britain as an Atlantic power, not as a European power, and felt that if Britain joined the common market, that would cause a transformation, make it a kind of America-dominated colonial enterprise.
The day after Rambouillet, Kennedy played host to Macmillan in the Bahamas. He had a proposition for him. He offered to supply the British with Polaris missiles, more powerful than all previous nuclear programs, on condition that the French accepted the same proposition. De Gaulle, of course, saw this as a trap laid by his American friend.
Kennedy felt that this would appease de Gaulle in some way, and this would ease the way for British entry into the common market.
La position de Kennedy, c'est un coup pour nous empêcher d'avoir une force nucléaire autonome. Car si nous acceptons d'avoir des Polaris, eh bien, à partir de ce moment-là, nous sommes dépendants des Américains pour le lancement de nos armes nucléaires, donc ils contrôlent notre arsenal nucléaire. Nous ne sommes plus indépendants.
Macmillan accepted, but what, wondered Washington, would be France's reaction?
Lorsque Macmillan a accepté d'abandonner tous les programmes de fusées et de prendre le Polaris pour fuser des sous-marins anglais, ce fait-là a été ressenti très, très durement par de Gaulle et ne l'a certainement pas bien disposé vis-à-vis de la candidature anglaise au marché commun.
Well, I think it was naive, but you're in a situation like that, you try anything that sounds reasonable.
The French response was slow in coming, and the White House grew impatient. Already, rumors from Paris were hinting at a refusal.
We expected him to say no. I think he looked at it politically as a dilution of French nationalism to work with the Americans.
On the 4th of January, de Gaulle was very evasive with Ambassador Bolan. But 10 days later,
il ne nous serait vraiment pas utile d'acheter des fusées Polaris alors que nous n'avons ni les sous-marins pour les lancer, ni les têtes thermonucléaires pour les armer.
It was a shock to Washington, but I really couldn't understand why it was a shock to Washington, because de Gaulle had set forth his general attitude on all these questions in his memoirs. I discovered that very few people at the State Department had read de Gaulle's. I shared the general Anglo-Saxon view of de Gaulle as a man of great qualities, but he could be a pain in the neck at the same time.
Kennedy called on the CIA. He knew now that it was impossible to intimidate de Gaulle, so he opted for a campaign of newspaper stories, smears, and rumors.
Le général, il ne se confiait pas à tout le monde, même pas à ses collaborateurs. Quand il avait envie de garder un secret ou une intention ou une malice, il la gardait pour lui.
What were his failings? Who would be willing to betray him? Some of those close to him leaked information across the Atlantic. Who were they?
J'ai pas de preuves, mais il y a des indices quand même assez sérieux. Quand le qui était de l'armée de l'air quitte ses fonctions par limite d'âge, on s'aperçoit 6 mois après qu'il devient d'une grande société d'armement américaine. Et si cette proposition lui est faite, c'est vraisemblablement parce qu'il avait auparavant, dans ses fonctions, d'excellents rapports avec les Américains.
The CIA set up its networks and bought up politicians and journalists, newspapers and unions, cinema and publishing companies in an attempt to turn French public opinion. Did this go beyond simple psychological pressure? Did the CIA organize destabilizing operations against de Gaulle? It wanted to give financial help to striking miners in the north of France, but Kennedy refused. The question is, was he obeyed? The CIA kept up its spying and learned that France would be ready to launch a nuclear submarine by 1967.
Les Américains surveillaient de très très près nos tirs nucléaires, de très très près. Ce qui était important pour les Américains, c'était que les prélèvements qu'ils faisaient après chacun de nos tirs leur permettaient de savoir où nous en étions.
Was this now a war between the US and France? No, not yet.
And therefore, as a free man, I take pride in the words, Ich bin ein Berliner.
But de Gaulle criticized Kennedy's June 1963 visit to Berlin, repeating that he had shown his disapproval of the wall of shame by staying away. The Americans rejoiced in the enthusiastic welcome of the German crowds, comparing the two men's trips on the TV news.
It is officially estimated that 350,000 greet the president as he arrives to attend Mass at that medieval cathedral. This is twice the number that welcomed President Charles de Gaulle in September, when he was here to woo Adenauer into the French camp. France has suggested that the U.S. might no longer be willing to...
Who was jealous of whom? On 26 July 1963, General de Gaulle and China were the two only abstainers at the signing of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty in Moscow. Why?
La France, du moment que d'autres en ont, ne sera certainement pas détournée par l'accord de Moscou de se doter elle-même de ces moyens-là. Faute de quoi, puisque les autres en ont, sa propre sécurité et sa propre indépendance ne lui appartiendraient jamais plus.
Les puissances atomiques n'ont pas l'intention du tout de nous installer à parité avec elles.
Imagine if in the missile crisis, France had had some involvement during the Cuban Missile Crisis, which was somehow separate and independent of the involvement of Washington. We had enough problems with respect to the use of nuclear weapons and all the rest of it, not to have to think about, oh yes, and what on earth is Paris going to do?
Ils craignaient, et avec juste titre, que dotée de l'arme nucléaire, la France se détache de l'OTAN, en disant, après tout, je n'ai pas besoin de vous.
John Fitzgerald Kennedy, de Gaulle's American friend, was assassinated in Dallas on 22 November 1963. De Gaulle led the cortege following his coffin. He hadn't met him since his visit to Paris. At the White House, the night of the funeral, de Gaulle was the first head of state to meet Lyndon B. Johnson. They did not get on.
Johnson said, there are two men in the world I will not denounce. One is de Gaulle, and the other is Mao Zedong. And the reason is they would each be delighted if I heard it denounced.
Such a compliment deserves one in return, and de Gaulle made his own unpleasant remarks about the American president, which the CIA duly reported back to Johnson. Relations between the two men could not have been worse.
We had a judgment about de Gaulle, which is a complex judgment. He was a complex man.
You know, he was just an impossible man to deal with. I mean, very clever. able to manipulate everything within reach.
Johnson thought of him as a damn nuisance.
Even though we had ambassadors over there who were very good, they had never been deeply accepted by the president over there. I'm sure they always presented their credentials, but they did not enjoy a relationship with him which enabled them to talk to him back and forth, man to man.
The CIA followed the general's movements and reported back to President Johnson. Regarding his Mexico trip, for example. Latin America was America's own backyard. A month before the trip to Mexico, the CIA intercepted de Gaulle's magnificent speech and transmitted it to the American State Department.
Mexicanos! El pueblo francés opone al pueblo mexicano. Marchemos la mano en la mano y viva México!
The president should include in his public remarks a bit of the Latin flavor which de Gaulle so beautifully exploits in the draft speech. At the end of this closely watched trip, the American Secret Services noted with relief that the crowds were only half the size of when Kennedy made this trip in 1961. Was it de Gaulle's intention to offend his American friend by not attending the June 1964 ceremony commemorating the Allied landings in Normandy? On 15th August, he turned up to commemorate the Provence landings in which French troops had been involved. Is it any wonder that the NATO question reared its ugly head once more? De Gaulle had already warned President Kennedy that he wasn't pleased with the treaty. Now he was to reiterate his objections, much to everyone's displeasure.
The 15 nations of NATO meet in the Netherlands with Secretary of State Dean Rusk representing the United States. This spring session of the Atlantic Alliance faces some knotty problems. De Gaulle's reluctance to keep French forces under NATO command is a question that will not be immediately resolved.
Le général de Gaulle l'a dit, s'il y a une guerre, il faut que ce soit sa guerre. Et par conséquent, le général de Gaulle ne veut pas que la France soit entraînée dans une guerre qui serait la guerre des États-Unis, par exemple.
Alors il y a eu des incidents, bien entendu, qui ont montré au général que les Américains, via l'OTAN, traitaient la République française, son territoire, ses dépendances, comme des sortes d'annexes où ils pouvaient improviser ce qu'ils désiraient sans rendre compte de ce qu'ils faisaient à personne.
J'ai assisté aux séances ministérielles 2 fois par an. Les Américains venaient avec leur ordre du jour, on ne parlait que de cela, et puis, quelles que soient les réponses qui pouvaient être faites par les Alliés, on ne faisait que ce que les Américains avaient décidé.
Il y a une chose que les Américains n'oublient jamais, c'est que ce qui est sacré, ce sont les intérêts des États-Unis. Le reste.
The CIA wanted to know what the French were planning. From May 1965 onwards, Robert Schwetzel of the State Department was in contact with a French informer.
There was a Frenchman who informed us of what was going on, someone who was concerned about the vulnerability of Europe if there were not an effective NATO with American deep involvement.
I want to be very careful about this because I don't know what has been declassified, but it is clear that what I do remember that a quite senior member of the French government, a senior civil servant, thought that General de Gaulle's policies were so mistaken and so would cause so much difficulty in terms of French interest that in fact he provided a warning for us, and I think my rough memory is that he was in very close contact with Chip Boland, who was our ambassador.
Schwetzel met this friend of America on the 17th of May in the American Embassy in London. He drew up a report for his superiors.
He came around to see me at our embassy in London. As is usual, he was most forthcoming and rather more
The mole
concerned
revealed that de Gaulle was going to
about the
leave
direction
NATO.
of
The
French
question was,
policy.
when? The mole went on snooping.
De Gaulle has been almost violently anti-American, to the point that this is almost a phobia. There is no chance whatsoever of any compromise. Indeed, there must be no sign of any American desire to seek a compromise. If the United States stands firm, then there is always the likelihood of the French receding.
Who was the informer? Even today, his name is blacked out on the declassified documents.
Il y avait dans le ministère des Affaires étrangères des hommes qui étaient très hostiles à la politique du général de Gaulle. Je crois que cet ou ces taupes, il y en a eu plusieurs, je pense, avaient la conscience tranquille. Et ils avaient l'impression qu'en en transférant aux États-Unis ces informations, ils agissaient non pas contre l'intérêt national, mais contre la politique du général de Gaulle qu'ils jugeaient néfaste pour la France.
The mole in the Quai d'Orsay kept the Americans informed hour by hour. At the 17th September press conference, nothing was revealed that they didn't already know.
En politique étrangère, il a annoncé pour 69 la fin de la subordination de la France à l'OTAN et évoqué l'entente qu'il envisageait de l'Oural à l'Atlantique.
De Gaulle said that France would leave NATO in 1969. The mole said 1966.
Les Américains, comme nos autres alliés, pensaient « Oh, De Gaulle en parle, mais jamais il n'osera le faire ».
Nous espérions que les Français ne quitteraient pas l'OTAN, parce que bien que les Français se soient retirés de l'organisation militaire, il y avait quand même la possibilité, en cas de crise ou de guerre ou de menace de guerre, d'utiliser les territoires français pour approvisionner les armées en Allemagne, etc.
La France, sans revenir sur son adhésion à l'Alliance Atlantique, la France va d'ici au terme...
On the 21st February 1966, de Gaulle was evasive, and the Allies didn't know what to think.
Et qui est le 4 avril 1969.
I have only seen the very brief press report regarding General de Gaulle's conference, which apparently has just concluded before this meeting, and I would much prefer to await a full report on the exact statement before getting into any detailed discussion involving the General's observations.
Did President Johnson really take de Gaulle seriously?
At that particular time, there's that steady evolution in American thinking, from admiration for this man, then to annoyance, and then finally seeing him a threat to America's basic interests.
On 7th March 1966, France officially informed President Johnson that it was leaving NATO.
We had anticipated it, so that by, I would guess, January, February, early March of 1966, it was a foregone conclusion. I would guess that both the agency, both the CIA, but also our embassy probably reported that this was in the works.
De Gaulle believed in the strategy of making a fait accompli and then forcing us to adjust to it. And I think the thing he did most wrong was to leave NATO.
American military personnel and installations in France may only be a memory if General de Gaulle's April 1st, 1960...
A debate raged in the White House over what course of action to take. Johnson settled the question.
Lyndon Johnson's reaction was that if a man asks you to leave his house, you take your hat and coat, bid him goodbye, and quietly leave. And that wasn't just a Texas saying. The calculation was, the strategic judgment was, that by far, that we had really no cards to play that would reverse that French decision. And it was Johnson's judgment that what was terribly important to make sure that the other European members of NATO would clearly understand and keep in mind that the initiative for this very trouble-causing affair came from Paris and not Washington.
With the Americans' departure, one of the general's goals had been achieved. What else did he want? Russia? In June 1966, he planned a controversial trip to the Soviet Union to watch a missile launching. The Americans saw this visit as a reversal of previous alliances, and Senator Acheson criticized de Gaulle.
He's going to Moscow in June. Now, he isn't going there just to leave his car to have a pleasant glass of vodka with some of the Russian leaders. He's going there to carry out the policy which he has talked about. This Europe from the Atlantic to the Urals. He believes that he can bring about this situation. He hasn't the slightest conception that his security depends upon the great number of armed Americans that stand between him and trouble, the great number of armed Germans and Dutchmen and Belgians, etc.
President Charles de Gaulle, wearing his army uniform, arrives at Moscow's airport for the start of a 12-day state visit.
The Soviet Union was looked as an absolutely overwhelming menace to us and to the world. And therefore, to have him go to Moscow was bound to, was to scare any rational person and say, what in the world is this man going to do, and how disruptive is he going to be to Western interests?
3 days later, thanks to the French mole, the CIA had an account of de Gaulle's meeting with Brezhnev and Kosygin. The report produced a sigh of relief in the White House. The French clearly had no delusions about the Soviets. With hindsight, it's easy to play down the Americans' sense of panic.
Journalists have to write stories. They have to introduce some drama. If there's no real drama, they'll introduce melodrama, but melodrama has an effect back because heads of governments read these stories and get upset and get excited, and their foreign ministers do, and heads of governments, foreign ministers have to make speeches. So there's a level of a kind of theater that goes on, the superstructure, but at the fundamental level, I don't think there was ever a serious issue.
Let us recapitulate. In 1967, NATO troops left France. De Gaulle repatriated French gold reserves from the United States, and 7 years before Nixon, recognized Mao's communist China. De Gaulle also repeatedly warned the Americans that Vietnam would be a crushing defeat for them. As the war intensified, he once more criticized America and renewed his calls for peace. His speech in Phnom Penh, Cambodia, cut the Americans to the quick. On 9th September 1966, de Gaulle arrived in Polynesia from Cambodia. It was a destination that had long been kept secret, but which the mole had revealed to the CIA. Was there yet more to discover?
À ce moment-là, les Américains ne se font plus d'illusions. Ils savent que nous disposons des explosifs nucléaires. Mais ils ont l'espoir que nous n'arriverons pas à mettre au point facilement, parce que ça coûte très cher, parce que c'est très compliqué, les lanceurs.
What was de Gaulle hiding behind all the colorful pageantry of his visit to Mururoa?
Le général tenait beaucoup à assister à un tir nucléaire. Il avait espéré que ce serait un tir thermonucléaire. Ça n'a pas été tout à fait un tir thermonucléaire, c'était une très très forte bombe A, mais pas une bombe H. La réaction du général de Gaulle, qui est à bord de ce navire où je suis à côté de lui, lorsque nous voyons cet immense champignon classique des tirs nucléaires, surtout lorsqu'ils ont lieu sur un atoll. La réaction de Gaulle, c'est de dire « c'est magnifique ». Pour lui, c'est magnifique, non pas parce que c'est une arme de destruction épouvantable, mais parce que c'est la réalisation française qui montre que la France est devenue une puissance nucléaire.
From now on, France was playing with the big boys. De Gaulle provoked the English speakers in Canada with his Vive le Québec libre. He was accused of encouraging the partition of a francophone province to make it more independent of its big American brother. The Democrats in Washington were discouraged.
You've got to realize that there are some issues on which we didn't take De Gaulle terribly seriously. De Gaulle had a number of pinpricks of the United States, but he was very careful not to push the United States on a major issue. But that was typical De Gaulle.
In fact, Johnson's opinion was that de Gaulle was not immortal and would soon be gone. But it was Lyndon Johnson who went first. He didn't stand in the 1968 elections. And the Republican Richard Nixon, Kennedy's old rival, was his successor.
Quand Nixon est élu, sa première visite à l'étranger, c'est Paris.
We thought it was a historic moment in the sense that we had really come to put an end to Franco-American quarrels.
At last, there was an American friend back in Paris.
Nixon avait de bons rapports personnels avec le général de Gaulle, ce qui n'avait jamais été le cas de ses prédécesseurs.
Nixon liked strong leaders. He sensed that de Gaulle made France stronger. He wanted a strong France in the alliance.
Malraux, Mesmer, Couve de Murville, the same old faces as when Kennedy visited in 1961. And once again in the Élysée Palace, de Gaulle steadfastly put the Americans on their guard.
It was a big reception at the Élysée. And an aide came over and said, the president would like to talk to you. So I went over to a man I had always admired, and he looked at me. He was much taller than I. He looked down at me, and he said, why don't you get out of Vietnam? First question. Didn't say, I'm happy to meet you or anything. And why don't you get out of Vietnam?
De Gaulle was nothing if not obstinate. But what about France's nuclear capability?
Kissinger me dit, je suis chargé par le président de vous dire que il ne prolongera pas l'opposition américaine à l'armement nucléaire français. Nous considérons que cet armement est un fait.
We gave the absolute outer limit of what we might be permitted to do. We had legal restrictions, which we interpreted, shall we say, generously. I don't think we did anything illegal, but we went very far within the established limits, but very far. We went to the outer edges.
But it was too late for de Gaulle. 2 months later, on 27th April 1969, he would step down as president.